All right, so whenever I tell people that I'm a graduate student researching Russian literature, the number one thing that I get told is like, oh, I just read Crime and Punishment, or I really want to read The Brothers Karamazov. And this is surprising to me. I've got to say, as somebody who studies this for a living, I would never take it upon myself to research Dostoevsky just because he is such a complex writer. And I honestly get surprised that these books are so popular in mainstream culture. But then I thought about it a little bit more and I reflected on a Dostoevsky course that I took in undergrad. And as I was reading through my notes, I feel like I fell in love with Dostoevsky all over again. Because I've had to read a lot and it can be very dark and heavy sometimes, but there is 1000% a reason why we still read Dostoevsky 200 years since his birth, and that's what I want to talk about today. So, like all great writers, Dostoevsky talks about universal themes which make his literature relevant today. So these are, what does it mean to be an independent thinker? What does it mean to feel different from everybody else? He talks about family. What sacrifices are people willing to make for their families? What do we say that we do in the names of our families, but really maybe conceal other motives? He talks a lot about generational divide between old and young, and that's why I think Dostoevsky has this allure specifically for young people. Obviously, you can read him at any age, but that kind of rebellious, revolutionary spirit is just running through his works. Suffering, of course. I mean, I get a little bit annoyed when people just assume that all Russian literature is about hardship and suffering, because that's obviously not the case. But with Dostoevsky, it pretty much is. He talks about murder. He looks at death really up close, rape, pedophilia, pretty much any kind of monstrous thing that human beings are capable of, suicide. He talks about it all. But for all the hardship that you read about in his fiction, there's also 100% a running undercurrent of light and of hope. And that comes from his Christian faith. And I think that this is something that people miss when they talk about Dostoevsky, which I'm surprised about. Maybe it's because he doesn't really hit you over the head with it in the same way that Tolstoy does. But Christianity was super important to him, and yeah, his plot lines are really ways of moralizing, of teaching people lessons. So that's something to be mindful of when you read. And another caveat is that he was extremely anti-Semitic. All right, so given the autobiographical elements embedded in his writing, I feel it's worth to briefly talk about who Dostoevsky was before he became the Dostoevsky that we all know and love. So he was born in 1821 in Moscow, and he was the first Russian writer to not come from the hereditary nobility. So already he's not like other writers. He talks about kind of this dark underbelly of society, about things and people that we would rather not think about. What else? Oh, his dad was murdered by their serfs or servants. At least this is what Dostoevsky believed with his whole heart. There wasn't a whole ton of evidence to prove that, but he believed that his dad was murdered by their serfs. And this becomes important in The Brothers Karamazov. Now, as a university student in St. Petersburg, Dostoevsky was a part of a group called the Petrushevsky Circle. And these circles were just groups of friends, essentially. It was a super popular phenomenon where these young intellectuals would gather at one of their friends' apartments and sit around and talk about ideas, basically like a salon. And Dostoevsky, along with all his buddies, was arrested in 1849. And a bit of context for this. In 1848, there was a series of revolutions sweeping across Europe, and Tsar Nicholas I was really scared that this was going to happen in his own empire, so he made a personal effort to squash revolutionary activity. All right, so halfway through filming this video, I feel like my plans for it have changed. I initially was going to give a whole overview of Dostoevsky's life and then talk about his works, and I realized it's just way too much. So to briefly sum up, Dostoevsky was arrested for reading this really controversial letter out loud, and I would love to spend so much time talking about it, but for the sake of preserving time, this letter was written by a literary critic, Vissarion Belinsky, addressed to a very prolific writer in the Empire, Nikolai Gogol, essentially criticizing Gogol for writing a book that really glorified the Tsar, glorified masters having serfs, glorified religion, and all of this was just so out of touch with the spirit of the time. But young people really loved both these writers. They loved Belinsky and they loved Gogol. So their fight was genuinely like a national divide. And this letter could not be published because of censorship, but it was clandestinely circulated. And that's what Dostoevsky read, and that's why he got in so much trouble. And typically the sentence for that sort of crime would have been exile to Siberia, but he was actually sentenced to death. And if you read the documents pertaining to his trial, you'll see that Tsar Nicholas had a personal involvement in rooting out these revolutionaries of the Petrushevsky circle. And you kind of see the, dare I say, sadomasochistic pleasure he took in these arrests and in instilling fear in the masses. So yeah, Dostoevsky was sentenced to death, and as he was lined up there with all his buddies waiting to be shot by the firing squad, somebody ran up at the last minute and whispered to the head executioner, and they changed the sentence to exile to Siberia. So imagine Dostoevsky thinks he's about to die and he doesn't. And this near-death experience inspired a religious conversion in him. He became a staunch Christian, and that faith carried him throughout his life. And I think that's something that's not talked about enough in mainstream culture, is just how Christian Dostoevsky was. And so while his fiction is not as moralizing as, let's say, that of Tolstoy, his books were serialized, right? They'd be published chapter by chapter, like Crime and Punishment, for instance, and they were meant to be thrilling stories. At least that novel, and the Brothers Karamazov too. Like, people were invested in these plot lines and characters, but at the same time, you cannot forget that this is a Christian man, a lover of Jesus and God, writing these. He is not promoting violence. He is not promoting any of the dark stuff that I mentioned previously. So please bear that in mind as you read, and I'm going to save an overview of Dostoevsky's books for a different video, but I feel like I've given you the necessary background info to get started. So by all means, pick up a copy of whatever Dostoevsky book you've been dying to read. I'll give my own recommendations in a separate video. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, genuinely. I really appreciate it. And take care. See you soon. Bye.